Gentlemen, in the last several years, the festival has organized a tribute night to pay homage to those great writers who, through their life and their works, has inspired us and the generation to come to live a brave life. Pramoedya Ananta Toer in flesh and blood. The movie is an excerpt from a very haunting documentary
Nå er det snakk om sekunder her, så nå merker jeg at pulsen er litt høyere. Ja,
Pramoedya Ananta Toer is one of Asia's most famous writers. Several times a candidate for the Nobel Prize in Literature. His own life was perhaps even more dramatic than the life of Minka, whom he writes about. He created his main works while he was a political prisoner living under inhuman conditions.
People called me Minka. My own name, for the time being, I need not tell it. Not because I'm crazy for mystery. I've thought about it quite a lot. I don't yet really need to reveal who I am before the eyes of others.
For Minka in colonial times, and for Pramoedya many years later, life became a struggle for freedom and justice, where art, humanity and beauty were used to oppose the forces of dictatorship.
Rumah kaca, the glass house, and it's one of the technology, and I got it through a friend, and he had to get it from Pasar Senen, which is a Senen Pasar, which is a black market. And I had to pay like 35,000, and it was like hush hush under the table, you know.
Pramoedya grew up in Indonesia while the country was still a Dutch colony, and the tension between Indonesia and Dutch culture puts its stamp on both his childhood and his literary work. Pramoedya's meeting with the Dutch language when he started school at the age of 6 was hard.
Itu dari bacaan dan dari sikap orang tua saya, sikap ayah saya. Ayah saya itu direktur sekolah Budi Tomo, saya sekolah di situ. Untuk lulus 7 kelas, saya
Cease to exist, build them up, or smash them down. It's her love.
Pramoedya established himself as a writer and journalist. He married and had 7 children. He became an active supporter of the new democracy and the country's first president, Sukarno. The world scene was dominated by the Cold War. Sukarno fought hard to keep the country independent, but strong forces were working against him. In September 1965, Sukarno lost power after a coup, and right-wing forces, with the support of Western powers, took control. A long and brutal military rule followed.
bukan soal Amerika, itu politiknya Eisenhower. Jadi Eisenhower menggariskan Soekarno harus disingkirkan. Soekarno itu dicintai rakyatnya. Ternyata caranya itu. Jadi orang-orang penyokong Soekarno itu yang dibunuh untuk menggulingkan Soekarno.
A few days after the coup came the events that turned Pramoedya's life upside down. Events that in time would make him the impressive figure he is today, 40 years later.
Sebelum itu ada...
But we would fight.
Watching the movie, but
more especially listening to the music and watching the children play. I had this feeling which I've had so many times. Actually, even after the books were translated over a period of, what was it now, probably 30 years or so, I had many discussions about life, about politics, and we shared the same ideological outlook, so there was a basis for a lot of intense discussion. And of course about Indonesia. And in the course of that, of course, I probably did get to know Pramoedya on a personal basis a little bit. There are many little stories he told me. Some, of course, about the experiences in Burung prison, about how the prisoners had to learn by experience that if you're going to barbecue rats as the only form of protein in the camp, that you had to take out the worms first. Otherwise, everyone would end up with diarrhea and other diseases. Or how the time a local person, an indigenous inhabitant of the island they were put on, was found in the bush, a woman trying to give birth. She couldn't do so. So she was taken to the prison camp where the prisoners, using acupuncture, successfully delivered the caesarean birth. Because the government of the day, in that province, on that island, and the prison administration themselves did not have the facilities to look after the woman who was the prisoner. Sometimes there wasn't such heavy stories about life in prison. Sometimes I'd watch him play with his grandchildren. Sometimes he would tell a joke. The one joke he would repeat over and over again was, when you were leaving his house, I'd say, "Permisi dulu." And he'd answer, which means, "Can I go now?" And or actually means, "Can I go first?" He would say, "Permisi dulu atau permisi sekarang?" You asking permission first, or are you asking permission now? I didn't really think it was all that funny, but somehow it still made me laugh. But you probably saw on the film, there was a couple of scenes there where he did laugh. And his laughter was, it seemed to me, was always a kind of laughter that he knew he should be laughing and he wanted to laugh, but somehow it was suppressed. And often after talking to him, when I was alone by myself, I tried to picture again the experience of sitting and chatting. And although I found out many things about him, there was always a kind of mystery there. Something I couldn't quite grasp. And although today I think I still don't grasp it, I think it's this, whatever it is that I don't grasp, that's somehow most important about it. I always had this feeling that he himself had a big question, a really, really big question that he couldn't answer, that disturbed him, that made him so uneasy. And the question was, where did my Indonesia go? Because when he came out of prison, 4 years in prison in Jakarta and 10 years on Pulau Buru, he came home, I'm certain that the Indonesia he saw was not the Indonesia he dreamed of when he fought the Dutch, when he wrote his first short stories in prison, when he joined with others after independence to start building Indonesia. And this is one thing I think certainly foreigners certainly an Australian will find it difficult to grasp. And even the young people today in Indonesia will find it difficult to grasp. That for his generation, Indonesia was a project of creation. To me, there's a secret in his 4 books, This Earth of Mankind through to Glass House. More than 1,300 pages of writing in a book, in a series of books which he himself said were stories about the Indonesian national awakening. And everybody, when they write about these 4 novels, use a term like that, Indonesian national awakening. But if you read them, you will not find the word Indonesia even once. Not even once would you find the word Indonesia. Of course, that's historically accurate. The word Indonesia in the time of Nyai Ontosoro and Minka did not exist. So he was being historically accurate. But there's a message there too. Indonesia is a project of creation. The people of Indonesia, which he so loved, were engaged in the process of creating something absolutely, totally new. That's what enthused people. That's where the semangat came from. In the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, how to create something new and what should that something new be like. Well, Pramoedya was a socialist. He wanted equality, democracy, and the ability for everyone to be creative. Other people had other visions for how Indonesia should be, but everyone in that period was driven by the desire to create something. Idealism was fundamental to Indonesian culture at that time. I don't mean Javanese culture, Balinese culture, Indonesian culture. Idealism was fundamental. And I often felt when he came out of prison and saw the new Indonesia, yes, many more buildings, many more cars, many more tourists visiting Bali, but the idealism to create something new, I know, I felt every time I talked with him, it was like something grating at his spirit. Where did my Indonesia go? And I'm pretty sure that his publishing This Earth of Mankind, the books that followed it, was his contribution to try and revive that idealism. To tell the younger generation of Indonesians that if you want to know where Indonesia came from a fight against injustice, a fight against inequality, a fight against racism, and a fight driven by the love of the people. Pramoedya had a special, I think, a specific attitude to the ordinary people, the rakyat of Indonesia. Bit different from other people because in the Indonesian context, many people, in politics at least, in the political sphere, many people talk about, mewakili rakyat, bicara di atas nama rakyat, speak in the name of the people, and so on. But for Pramoedya, especially as he developed as a writer, the rakyat was the people as they experienced the kind of day-to-day reality of struggle, including the political struggle to change history. He didn't want to romanticize the rakyat. He wanted to research what the reality was. He was an incredible researcher. Anyone can go and visit his house now, still kept by his family, with the incredible archives that he rebuilt after his release from prison. He was an incredible researcher. And I'll just tell you one other little story here because it just gives you an idea of how his researching mind thought. He was very sensitive to the usual sources of research. Archives. Before he was in prison, he was a regular visitor to the archives. But I know, for example, he used other sources. There's one student of his, because he lectured at a university before he was arrested in 1965, as well as writing. The student, Max, said to me one day, I'll tell you a story about when Pram told me to do some research. What? He said, Pram told me to go and interview somebody to get information about a political leader. But I didn't do it. I thought I had a better source. And he failed my essay because I didn't use the source he said. Who is the source? I asked. The source was this political figure in Jakarta. This political figure's Baba. This political figure had told every time he had his hair cut, had just Toer, what's the English? Just chatted on about what had been happening in the political world, and the Baba had this enormous knowledge of politics straight from the horse's mouth. So the sources were not just archives, but from the people themselves. One of the best essays written by Pramoedya, unfortunately, is still not published in English, also reflects this fanaticism about putting the people at the center of the state. This was an essay titled, "The Last Time I Watched the Wayang Performance." He considered Javanese Wayang, probably Balinese Wayang too, to be utterly and totally reactionary. He had to see one performance in prison, so that's what the essay was based on. But he thought Wayang was utterly and completely reactionary. Because he said in all of the classical stories of Wayang, never once, not even once, does an ordinary person appear in the story. A peasant, a farmer, not even once. They don't exist. They don't exist in reality at all in the picture of society depicted by Wayang. And that's how he saw the New Order regime. That's how he saw the Indonesian society that was created by the New Order regime. One where the ordinary people are negated, where they don't exist, where they are now just ksatria, soldiers, in the bad sense of the word, bukan pukul he would call them, the thugs, and the Brahmin, the ideologues who justified the system of oppression that existed. So Pram, I think, you can read it in some of the interviews that he gave towards the end of his life, remained till the very end a revolutionary. In a couple of small books published in 1 or 2 years before he passed away, there's a question, what about the future? Indonesia needs a social revolution. You need to wipe out the elite down to the very last jackal. Wipe them out was his, wipe them away was what he thought was the only way forward for Indonesia. I think he never changed from 1950s, 1960s, the trials and tribulations of his time on Buru Island. He saw, especially when he came back, when he was asking that question, where did my Indonesia go? I think he only saw two possibilities. Social revolution that would get rid of all of the junk that had accumulated in power as a result of the New Order period. And the second thing he hoped for was something to come from the youth. That was his message again and again every time he spoke in public. Don't put your trust in my generation for a single moment. Trust only in the youth. And on that point, you come back again to this problem, the youth. What can happen to the youth when the reality of Indonesia's historical experience is hidden from them? When Pramoedya's books, you try and think of it, Pramoedya's books came out in the 1980s, they were banned. Now you can buy them in the bookshop, but they're not taught in school. So Pramoedya's books and all the other great books of Indonesian literature, there are about 100 million children over the last 40 years who have never read one of them, never been introduced to one of them. through the school system. I think for anybody that has the same conclusion as Pramoedya, that it's the youth that can change the situation, can bring back the Indonesia of idealism that he hankered for, he longed for. One thing that has to be struggled for is to bring back literature uncensored into the Indonesian schools. And that will be a struggle. And if anyone who's been in Indonesia for the last few days has been reading the newspapers, you can see it will still be a struggle. 30th of September, 3 days ago, is the anniversary of the events that led to Pramoedya being imprisoned. The adventurous activities of some military officers and their political friends, which went awry and gave General Suharto the pretext and the opportunity to seize power. Just look at the debate over the last 3 days in the Indonesian newspapers with, for example, one minister saying the mass killings of 1965 are justified. They are justified because without those mass killings we would not have the Indonesia we have today. Actually, probably true. But when that comes from a minister, what kind of effort, nationally and internationally, is going to be needed to make sure the legacy of Pramoedya actually reaches the young generation of Indonesia? And it is an international issue because the Indonesian government minister of today, who said the mass killings were justified, is only echoing, for example, what the Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, said in 1965, quote, with 1 million Reds dead, something good must have happened. So I think it's a responsibility of all of us, if we want Pramoedya's legacy to continue, and to be able to be enjoyed, appreciated by the young people of Indonesia, that anything we can do to promote his books, to promote his legacy, to give support for them to be read in Indonesia itself and internationally, must be a priority for us if we want that legacy passed on.